You are standing, in your mind, in a bedchamber in Babylon, in the heat of early summer in the year 323 before the Common Era. The air is close and heavy, thick with the smell of oil lamps and the particular stillness that gathers around a room where everyone present already suspects what is coming. A king lies on a couch too short for the restless energy he has carried his whole life, a man not yet 33 years old, whose name, before he ever drew a sword in anger, had already been shaped by a philosopher, a mother who believed he was descended from gods, and a father who conquered half of Greece before his own son had learned to ride. For 10 days, fever has moved through his body in waves, and for 10 days, the men who commanded his armies, men who had followed him across deserts and mountain passes no army had crossed before, who had watched him walk into arrow fire at the front of every charge rather than direct a battle from behind it, have taken turns standing at his bedside, waiting for him to say something that would tell them what happens next. According to several of the surviving accounts, his generals finally asked him the one question an empire cannot survive being left unanswered: to whom do you leave your kingdom? And the answer he is said to have given, whether myth softened by centuries of retelling or something close to his actual dying breath, was this: to the strongest. 3 words, if the tradition is accurate, that read less like a plan and more like a challenge thrown down at men he had spent 13 years training to fight for him rather than against each other. Some ancient writers record a variant tradition instead, in which Alexander, already too weak to speak clearly, passed his signet ring to one of his generals, an act some in the room chose to read as a deliberate designation of an heir and others read as nothing more than a dying man surrendering an object he could no longer hold, a small, telling disagreement in the sources that captures, in miniature, exactly how much ambiguity his own officers would spend the next several decades exploiting. Within days, he would be dead. Within a generation, the empire he built would not exist in any form he would have recognized, torn apart limb from limb by the very officers standing in that room. This is not, in the end, primarily a story about how one man conquered most of the known world before the age of 33, remarkable as that fact remains. It is a story about what an empire is actually made of, not walls, not law codes, not standing bureaucracies, but the singular will of one extraordinary human being, and what happens to everything he built the moment that will is extinguished. You will follow a boy born in a mountain kingdom most of the civilized Mediterranean considered half barbarian, tutored by the greatest mind of his age, crowned before he was truly a man, and set loose upon an empire 10 times the size of the one he inherited. You will watch him burn cities and found others in his own name, walk into a desert oracle to be told he was the son of a god, march an army to the edge of India and watch that same army finally refuse to go one step further. And you will watch, at the very end, what is left when the center of all of it simply stops breathing. We will not pretend the record is cleaner than it is. Much of what survives about Alexander comes to us through historians writing centuries after his death, drawing on earlier sources now lost, shaped by their own agendas and the political needs of the Roman world in which several of them wrote. Where the evidence holds together across multiple independent accounts, this telling will say so plainly. Where it thins into legend, and with a life this mythologized, it thins often, it will tell you that too, and let you weigh the uncertainty for yourself. Consider, for a moment, what makes this particular death scene so different from the deaths of most other ancient kings. A king who dies old, having already crowned an adult son, leaves behind a transition the historical record barely bothers to narrate, because the machinery of succession simply continues turning without him. A king who dies young, at the height of his power, having spent 13 years building an empire around nothing but the force of his own personality, leaves behind a question that no institution in his kingdom was ever built to answer. That is the peculiar trap Alexander's own success had built for him. Every structure of government he had assembled across 3 continents ran, in the end, through his own person, his own decisions about which general held which territory, his own marriages, his own alliances, his own unresolved promises about who would inherit what. Remove the man, and you do not simply create a vacancy at the top of an otherwise functioning system. You remove the system itself. To understand how a man could come this far this fast, and how his empire could unravel this completely once he was gone, you have to start where he did, not on a battlefield, but in the fractious, blood-soaked court of a mountain kingdom called Macedon, and the household of a father whose own ambitions would very nearly overshadow his son's, had his son not gone on to overshadow the ambitions of every king before him. Alexander was born in the summer of 356 BCE in the Macedonian capital of Pella to King Philip II and his wife Olympias, a princess of Epirus with a reputation, even among contemporaries inclined to flatter royalty, for a fierce and unusual religious devotion. Ancient writers record, with the kind of certainty that should make you a little suspicious, that Olympias practiced rites connected to the cult of Dionysus involving live serpents handled during ecstatic ritual, and that she claimed, at various points in her son's life, that Alexander's true father was not Philip at all, but Zeus himself, arriving in her bedchamber in the form of a serpent or a bolt of lightning depending on which version of the story you were told and by whom. Whether Olympias believed this literally, encouraged it as useful political theater, or simply allowed the rumor to spread because it flattered her son's growing sense of destiny, historians still debate. What is clear is that Alexander grew up inside a household where the line between political ambition and divine entitlement had never been drawn especially firmly to begin with. Macedon itself, in the middle of the 4th century BCE, occupied an uncomfortable position in the Greek world. To the south, in cities like Athens and Thebes, Macedonians were widely regarded as semi-barbarian cousins of true Hellenic culture, Greek enough to compete in the Olympic Games, which admitted only Greeks, but rustic enough that orators like Demosthenes could reliably win applause in Athens by sneering at Macedonian kings as uncivilized upstarts from the mountains. Philip II had inherited a kingdom that was, by the standards of the great southern city-states, poor, fractured by rival noble families, and militarily unremarkable. Over roughly 2 decades of relentless campaigning and diplomatic maneuvering, he transformed it into the single most powerful military state in the Greek-speaking world, reorganizing the Macedonian army around a lengthened pike called the Sarissa and a system of combined infantry and cavalry tactics that would prove, in his son's hands, unlike anything the ancient Mediterranean had yet seen deployed on a battlefield. The military instrument Philip built was, in its own right, one of the more significant innovations in ancient warfare. The Sarissa itself measured somewhere between 4 and 6 meters in length, far longer than the spears carried by traditional Greek hoplite infantry, and required a soldier to grip it with both hands, sacrificing the large shield that had defined Greek infantry combat for centuries in exchange for a wall of overlapping spear points that could keep an enemy line at a distance no conventional infantry formation could easily close. Philip paired this reformed phalanx with an elite cavalry arm recruited from Macedon's landed nobility, men who held the honorific title of companions and who trained from boyhood in horsemanship the way Athenian citizens trained in oratory, creating a combined arms system in which infantry pinned an enemy line in place while cavalry delivered the actual decisive blow against a flank or a gap. A template Alexander would inherit essentially intact and then execute with a boldness his father's own generalship, cautious and probing by comparison, had never quite risked. Macedonian court life itself revolved heavily around the institution of the symposium, a formal drinking banquet at which nobles, officers, and the king himself reclined together late into the night. And it was at exactly this kind of gathering, fueled by the unwatered wine Macedonians were famous even among other Greeks for drinking in quantity, that a great many of the court's most consequential arguments, alliances, and betrayals took shape, a pattern that would recur, with genuinely fatal consequences, more than once in Alexander's own adult life. The court Alexander grew up inside was, by any honest account, a dangerous place to be a child. Philip married numerous times over the course of his reign, largely for the diplomatic alliances each marriage secured with a different neighboring people or noble faction, and each new wife brought with her the possibility of a rival heir who might one day contest Alexander's own claim to the throne. Macedonian kingship itself, unlike the hereditary monarchies of the settled civilizations further east, functioned in practice as something closer to a position that had to be actively maintained through the loyalty of the army and the leading noble families rather than simply inherited by unquestioned right of birth, and a Macedonian assembly of soldiers retained, at least in principle, a role in acclaiming or rejecting a proposed king, a fact that meant even a clearly designated heir-like. Alexander could not simply assume his father's throne would pass to him without the practical, demonstrated support of the men who would have to fight for him. Olympias, for her part, is described by multiple ancient sources as intensely protective of her son's position and deeply, sometimes ruthlessly, engaged in the factional politics of the Macedonian court, cultivating alliances and nursing grudges with an intensity that shaped her son's own instincts for both loyalty and suspicion long before he ever commanded an army of his own. Some modern historians caution against reading her later reputation for scheming too literally, noting that surviving sources about powerful royal women in antiquity tend, with tiresome consistency, to cast them as manipulative or unnatural regardless of what they actually did. Still, the pattern of tension between Olympias and Philip, and between Olympias and Philip's other wives, appears often enough across independent accounts that some real friction almost certainly underlay the later stories. From an early age, Alexander displayed the kind of restless, competitive energy that Macedonian court culture was specifically built to reward. Macedonian aristocratic education emphasized horsemanship, hunting, and above all, the capacity to lead men in battle, since a Macedonian noble's standing rested less on inherited title than on demonstrated courage and the loyalty he could command from the soldiers under him. Ancient biographers record that as a boy, Alexander showed little interest in athletic competitions of pure speed, reportedly telling companions he would only race if kings were his competitors. An anecdote that may be later invention polishing the legend, but one that captures something ancient writers clearly believed was true of his temperament even this early, an instinct that ordinary achievement, however impressive, held little appeal next to the prospect of surpassing kings. Alexander's early education, before Aristotle's arrival, followed the conventional pattern of Macedonian royal upbringing, a rotating set of tutors covering music, poetry, and basic literacy, alongside an early tutor named Leonidas, a stern relative of Olympias who reportedly enforced a famously austere physical regimen on the young prince, and another figure, Lysimachus, remembered chiefly for nicknaming Alexander after the Homeric hero Achilles, a piece of flattery that appears to have taken root in the boy's imagination far more deeply than anyone at the time could have anticipated. Macedonian royal sons were also customarily enrolled, in their early adolescence, as one of the king's royal pages, a body of young noble boys who served the king directly, standing guard at his chambers, attending him at the hunt and in battle, and absorbing, through years of close daily proximity, both the practical mechanics of court politics and the ever-present possibility of violent death that surrounded any Macedonian king closely enough. It was this same restless, unsatisfied ambition, paired with a genuine gift for absorbing whatever was taught to him, that would soon bring the greatest living philosopher in the Greek world to the Macedonian court, tasked with the improbable job of teaching a headstrong prince how to think as carefully as he already knew how to fight. When Alexander was 13 years old, Philip made a decision that would shape the intellectual character of his son's entire life. He invited Aristotle, a philosopher then in his early 40s who had studied for 2 decades under Plato in Athens, to come to Macedon and personally oversee the prince's education. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary investment. Aristotle was not simply hired as a tutor in the ordinary sense. Philip provided him with a dedicated retreat at a place called Mysa, a walled garden and set of shaded walkways and grottos some distance from the noise and intrigue of the Pella court, where Aristotle taught not only Alexander but a select circle of Macedonian noble youths who would go on to become some of his most important generals and administrators in the years ahead. The curriculum Aristotle brought with him ranged across nearly the whole of Greek intellectual life as it then existed: logic and rhetoric, natural philosophy and biology, ethics and politics, and, perhaps most consequentially for the world Alexander would later reshape, a deep, careful engagement with Homer's Iliad, which Aristotle is said to have personally annotated for his royal student. Alexander reportedly kept this annotated copy with him for the rest of his life, carrying it on campaign inside an ornamental box captured from the Persian king's own baggage train, and sleeping, according to Plutarch, with both the text and a dagger beneath his pillow, one for the mind, he is said to have joked, and one for the body. Whatever the literal truth of that detail, the broader claim behind it is well supported. Alexander appears to have modeled significant parts of his own self-conception on Achilles, Homer's doomed, glory-hungry warrior, and would later make a point, upon first setting foot in Asia, of visiting the traditional site of Troy specifically to honor Achilles' memory. A piece of theater that tells you as much about how Alexander wanted his own campaign understood as it does about any genuine antiquarian curiosity. Among the noble youths who studied alongside Alexander at Mysa were several boys whose names would later fill the highest ranks of his army and, after his death, the ranks of the generals who tore his empire apart. Ptolemy, a somewhat older companion who would eventually seize Egypt and found a dynasty that outlasted every other successor state, Hyphasis, who would become Alexander's closest personal companion for the whole of his adult life, and Cassander, son of Philip's own trusted general Antipater, whose later role in the empire's fracture would prove among the most consequential and the most ruthless of them all. Whether Aristotle's teaching meaningfully shaped the political instincts of these future rulers, or whether Mysa simply happened to be the place where an unusually talented cohort of ambitious young men grew up together and later put their own native instincts to use once real power came within reach, is a question the ancient sources do not really allow you to answer with confidence, but the coincidence of that particular schoolroom producing that particular generation of conquerors and kings is, at minimum, difficult to entirely dismiss as accident. Aristotle's political teaching, by contrast, sits somewhat uneasily against the man Alexander would become. Aristotle held, in works that survive from roughly this period of his career, that non-Greek peoples were natural inferiors suited to a kind of subordinate role relative to Greeks, and is said to have counseled Alexander to treat Greeks as free citizens to be led, and non-Greeks as something closer to livestock or slaves to be managed. Alexander's actual policy as king would diverge from this advice in some genuinely striking ways. He would go on to adopt Persian court dress, incorporate Persian nobles into his administration, and arrange mass intermarriages between his own officers and Persian noblewomen, choices some ancient sources suggest caused real friction between the two men later in life, even as they disagree on exactly how far that estrangement went, or whether it reflected philosophical disagreement at all rather than the ordinary drifting apart of a busy king and an aging former tutor. Alongside this formal education ran another story almost as central to how later generations understood Alexander's character, the taming of a horse named Bucephalus. According to Plutarch's account, a Thessalian horse trader brought an enormous, wild-tempered stallion to Philip's court for sale, a horse so unmanageable that none of Philip's own experienced grooms could mount it, and Philip, unimpressed, ordered the animal taken away as worthless. Alexander, still a boy at the time, is said to have noticed what the grown men around him had missed, that the horse was not vicious, but afraid of its own shadow moving on the ground in front of it, and asked his father's permission to try where the professionals had failed. Turning the horse to face the sun so its shadow fell behind it, Alexander is said to have calmed and mounted Bucephalus in front of the assembled court, prompting Philip, according to the story, to weep and declare that Macedon was too small a kingdom for his son's ambitions. Bucephalus would go on to carry Alexander through most of his major campaigns over the following 2 decades, dying, according to tradition, of wounds and old age during the Indian campaign, at which point Alexander founded a city and named it in the horse's honor, a small detail, but one that tells you something real about the loyalty Alexander was capable of extending to those, human or animal, who had proven themselves at his side. The horse itself, by ancient description, was marked by a distinctive white blaze on an otherwise dark coat and a brand in the shape of an ox's head, which some ancient writers took to be the literal source of the animal's name, meaning roughly ox-headed in Greek, though others suggest the name instead described the animal's unusually broad, wide-set skull. Whatever its origin, the name would end up attached, through Alexander's own campaigns, to more places on the map than almost any other single word associated with his reign apart from his own. This same formation, philosophical rigor married to an almost theatrical hunger for glory, was about to be tested far sooner than anyone at Nisa could have anticipated, because back in Pella, the king who had arranged all of it was approaching the end of his own reign, and the manner of that ending would thrust his 16-year-old son into power decades ahead of schedule. Philip's final years were dominated by his ambition to lead a unified Greek and Macedonian expedition against the Persian Empire, a project he had spent years assembling the diplomatic and military groundwork for through a body called the League of Corinth, which formally recognized him as supreme military commander of an alliance spanning most of the Greek mainland. The League itself had been imposed on the southern Greek cities only after Philip's decisive military victory over a combined Athenian and Theban army at the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BCE, a battle in which the 18-year-old Alexander is credited by several ancient sources with commanding the decisive cavalry charge that broke the previously undefeated Theban sacred band, an elite unit of paired lovers sworn to fight to the death beside one another, whose near-total annihilation at Kyrenia marked, as much as any single event could, the effective end of genuine Greek city-state independence from Macedonian power. The League's charter formally committed its member states to a joint invasion of Persia, framed publicly as a war of Pan-Hellenic vengeance for the Persian invasions of Greece a century and a half earlier, though the practical reality was that most southern Greek cities participated because Macedonian military supremacy left them little realistic alternative, a resentment that would surface again, violently, within days of Philip's own death. Before he could lead that expedition east, however, Philip's personal life produced a crisis that would prove fatal to him. Late in his reign, he took a new wife, a young Macedonian noblewoman named Cleopatra, no relation to the later Egyptian queen, whose uncle, a powerful noble named Attalus, reportedly made a toast at the wedding feast expressing hope for a legitimate, fully Macedonian heir, a remark widely understood in the room as a pointed slight against Alexander, whose mother was a foreign-born Epirot princess. According to Plutarch, Alexander responded by hurling a cup at Attalus and demanding to know whether the man was calling him a bastard, and Philip, drunk and furious, drew his sword and attempted to move against his own son before stumbling and falling, prompting Alexander to remark, with a coldness that later writers found telling, that here was a man preparing to cross from Europe into Asia who could not even cross safely from one couch to another. Alexander and Olympias both left the court shortly afterward, Olympias returning to her native Epirus and Alexander eventually going into a period of estrangement before a fragile reconciliation was arranged. The episode illustrates, regardless of its precise details, just how volatile the question of succession remained even with an obvious, capable adult heir already standing in the room. In the autumn of 336 BCE, at the ancient Macedonian capital of Aegae, Philip staged an enormous public festival to celebrate the marriage of his daughter, timed deliberately to project Macedonian power and unity to a gathered audience that included ambassadors from across the Greek world on the eve of his planned invasion of the Persian Empire. During the festival's procession into the theater, one of Philip's own royal bodyguards, a young Macedonian noble named Pausanias, approached the king and stabbed him to death in full view of the assembled crowd, before being cut down himself moments later by other guards as he attempted to flee toward waiting horses. The motive behind the assassination has never been settled with certainty, and ancient sources offer competing explanations that historians continue to argue over today. Some accounts describe a personal grievance. Pausanias had reportedly been the victim of a serious sexual assault arranged by Attalus, the same noble whose toast had provoked Alexander's earlier confrontation with Philip, and had received no meaningful justice for it despite bringing his complaint to the king himself. Other accounts, then and now, have pointed suspicion toward Olympias, toward Alexander, or toward the Persian court, each of whom had some conceivable motive to want Philip removed before he could complete the very invasion he had spent years preparing. No surviving source provides conclusive proof implicating any of these parties directly, and modern historians remain genuinely divided on the question. Some treating the personal grievance explanation as sufficient on its own, others suspecting a wider conspiracy that the personal grievance was merely used to justify or conceal. The case for Persian involvement rests chiefly on the observation that Philip's planned invasion posed a direct and serious threat to the Achaemenid throne. and that Persian kings had a documented history of using bribery and covert influence to destabilize Greek politics from a distance rather than risk open war. The case against Olympius and Alexander's direct involvement rests partly on the practical difficulty of proving a negative this far removed in time, and partly on the observation that ancient sources hostile to powerful women in particular had every rhetorical incentive to assign Olympius blame for almost any convenient death in her vicinity, whether or not she had any hand in it. What can be said is that the assassination, whoever ultimately orchestrated or merely permitted it, benefited Alexander enormously and immediately, removing a father whose own remarriage had begun to cast some doubt on his son's uncontested claim to the succession at the exact moment that claim was about to matter more than it ever had before. What can be said with more confidence is what happened in the assassination's immediate aftermath. Within days, Alexander, then 20 years old, was proclaimed king by the Macedonian army and nobility, and moved with a speed that left little room for rival claimants to organize any serious opposition. That speed included the elimination of potential threats to his new throne with a thoroughness that later ancient writers described in unflinching terms. Several Macedonian nobles with rival royal blood or ambiguous loyalties were executed in the weeks following Philip's death, along with, according to some accounts, members of Cleopatra's own family, and, most disturbingly to some ancient commentators, Cleopatra's infant child by Philip, an act attributed by several sources chiefly to Olympius's initiative rather than her son's direct order, though Alexander's own toleration of it, at minimum, is not seriously disputed by ancient or modern historians. This is a pattern worth sitting with honestly rather than smoothing over. The same young man who had spent years absorbing Aristotle's careful ethical philosophy at Mysa came to his throne through, and immediately following it presided over, a purge that by any standard of the philosophy he had just been taught would have been difficult to justify. Ancient monarchy in this period offered few gentler paths to secure power, and Alexander, whatever his personal temperament, chose the path that Macedonian royal precedent and plain political necessity both pointed toward. Alexander also moved quickly against several distant cousins with their own claims to Macedonian royal blood, most notably two princes of the old royal house of Lyncestis, one of whom was executed within weeks of Philip's death on suspicion of involvement in the assassination, while another, a son-in-law of the general Antipater whom Alexander needed to keep on side, was spared for a time before eventually being executed years later on separate charges of conspiracy, a slower, more calculated example of the same underlying instinct. Any rival claim to the throne, however distant or however loyal its holder currently appeared, represented a risk that a new king still consolidating his own position could not indefinitely tolerate. With his throne secured at home, and with the southern Greek cities testing whether his father's death meant Macedonian dominance over Greece had died with him, Alexander turned first not east toward Persia, but south, to remind the Greek world in the most forceful terms available exactly whose hands the League of Corinth's authority now rested in. Word of Philip's assassination triggered immediate unrest among several Greek cities that had chafed under Macedonian hegemony, most seriously in Thebes, where a rumor spread that Alexander himself had been killed campaigning in the north, prompting the city to openly revolt against Macedonian authority and besiege the Macedonian garrison still stationed on its Acropolis. Alexander's response was swift and, when Thebes refused terms of surrender, catastrophic. Macedonian forces, joined by troops from other Greek cities eager to settle old scores against Thebes, stormed the city, and in the sack that followed, an estimated 6,000 Thebans were killed and the survivors, some accounts suggest as many as 30,000 people, were sold into slavery, while the city itself was razed to the ground, with the notable exception, ancient sources report, of the house once belonging to the poet Pindar, spared on Alexander's specific order out of respect for Greek literary heritage. The destruction of Thebes sent an unmistakable message to the rest of the Greek world about the cost of resistance, and it worked. No other major Greek city attempted open revolt against Macedonian authority for the remainder of Alexander's reign. It is worth pausing here on what this episode actually tells you, because it complicates any simple narrative of Alexander as purely a visionary unifier of the Greek world. The same young king capable of sparing a single poet's house out of genuine cultural reverence was, in the same campaign, willing to erase an entire ancient city and enslave tens of thousands of its people to make a political point. Both things were true of him simultaneously, and both would remain true, in different forms, for the rest of his life. With Greece pacified through terror as much as diplomacy, and with the League of Corinth formally confirming him as supreme commander for the planned invasion of Persia that his father had spent years preparing, Alexander turned his attention east. In the spring of 334 BCE, he led an army of roughly 30 to 40,000 infantry and cavalry, Macedonians, allied Greeks, and various mercenary and allied contingents, across the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Europe from Asia Minor, and a crossing loaded, quite deliberately, with symbolic weight. The financial position from which Alexander launched this invasion was, by several ancient accounts, considerably shakier than the eventual scale of his conquests might suggest. Philip's own treasury had been substantially depleted by decades of campaigning and the expensive business of building and maintaining Macedonian regional dominance, and Alexander is reported by at least one source to have set out for Asia with the royal treasury carrying significant outstanding debts and barely enough funds to sustain his army for a matter of weeks. A detail that makes the scale of his eventual ambitions look less like the product of secure, patient planning and considerably more like a calculated gamble by a young king who understood that his campaign would have to become self-financing through captured Persian wealth almost immediately or collapse under its own logistical weight. According to several ancient accounts, Alexander himself steered one of the ships across the strait, and upon reaching the Asian shore, threw a spear into the ground as a claim upon the land as territory won by the spear rather than granted by treaty. He then made a point of visiting the site traditionally associated with ancient Troy, where he is said to have honored the tomb of Achilles with a ritual foot race run naked alongside his companions in the old Homeric fashion, laid a wreath upon the grave, and exchanged, according to the tradition, some of his own armor for relics supposedly connected to the Trojan war heroes. The theater of this gesture was entirely deliberate. Alexander was not simply invading the Persian Empire, he was framing his entire campaign, from its opening moment, as a second Trojan War, a Greek expedition against an Asian power, with himself cast quite consciously in the role of a new Achilles, chasing glory that would outlive him the way Achilles' own had. Whether this framing reflected genuine personal conviction, calculated propaganda aimed at his largely Greek and Macedonian soldiers, or some inseparable mixture of both, it set the emotional register for everything that followed. The Persian Empire he was marching into was, at this point in its long history, the largest and wealthiest state the world had yet seen, stretching from the Aegean coast to the Indus River, ruled by a great king named Darius III who commanded resources and manpower that dwarfed anything Alexander's much smaller army could muster on paper. It would take Alexander only a matter of weeks to discover that paper superiority and battlefield reality were two very different things. Alexander's first major engagement on Persian soil came within weeks of the crossing, at the Granicus River in northwestern Asia Minor, where a Persian force under several regional satraps, reinforced by Greek mercenaries fighting for Persian pay, attempted to block his advance. The battle, fought across a riverbank that gave the defenders a natural advantage, nearly cost Alexander his life directly. Several ancient accounts describe him being struck on the helmet by a Persian noble's sword hard enough to split it, saved from a fatal blow only by the intervention of one of his companions, who cut down the attacker a moment before a second strike could land. This was not an isolated incident of recklessness. Throughout his career, Alexander fought at the front of his own cavalry charges rather than directing battles from a safe distance, a command style that cost him numerous serious wounds over the following decade. A shoulder pierced by an arrow at Gaza, a leg broken by a catapult bolt during the Central Asian campaigns, a chest wound from an arrow that punctured a lung during the Indian campaign and nearly killed him outright. Injuries that, taken together, suggest a man for whom personal risk was not merely tolerated as a regrettable cost of command, but treated as something close to a necessary proof, repeated again and again, of the personal courage his entire claim to authority over his soldiers ultimately rested on. This style of leadership stood in sharp contrast to the practice of Darius, who according to Persian custom commanded from a more protected position at the center of a much larger force. The Persian and Greek mercenary forces at Granicus were routed, with the mercenaries in particular suffering heavy losses when Alexander, in a decision later criticized by some ancient commentators, ordered the surviving Greek mercenary prisoners sent back to Macedon in chains as an example to other Greeks who might consider fighting for Persian coin against their own countrymen. Granicus opened the coastal cities of Asia Minor to Alexander's advance, and over the following months, city after city, particularly those with substantial Greek populations chafing under Persian-appointed governors, surrendered or were captured, with Alexander frequently presenting himself not as a foreign conqueror but as a liberator restoring Greek self-governance to communities that had lived under Persian rule for generations. The one significant exception during this stretch of the campaign came at the city of Halicarnassus, where a determined Persian garrison, reinforced by Greek mercenaries under a capable commander, forced Alexander into a costly and only partially successful siege, ultimately burning much of the city themselves rather than allow it to fall intact. A reminder that not every Persian-held city crumbled as easily as the coastal towns eager to greet Alexander as a liberator rather than merely a new master. It was also during this early phase of the campaign, at the Phrygian city of Gordium, that Alexander encountered the puzzle that would give rise to one of the most famous stories associated with his name. An ancient wagon, said to have belonged to a legendary king named Gordius, bound to its yoke by an intricately tied knot of cornel bark, which local tradition held could only be undone by the man destined to rule all of Asia. Numerous ambitious visitors had reportedly attempted and failed to untie it before Alexander arrived. According to the most commonly repeated version of the story, Alexander, faced with a knot he could not work loose by patient untangling, simply drew his sword and cut through it in a single stroke, declaring the terms of the prophecy satisfied regardless of the method used to fulfill them. A less dramatic alternative account, preserved by at least one ancient historian, suggests he instead removed a pin securing the yoke pole, allowing the knot to slip free without any sword at all. Which version is closer to the truth may be unrecoverable at this distance, but the story's staying power says something important about how Alexander wanted, and was understood, to operate. Confronted with an obstacle that rewarded patience and careful method, he chose instead the fastest, most theatrical solution available, and simply declared the problem solved on his own terms. The decisive early confrontation with Darius himself came in the autumn of 333 BCE, near the town of Issus in southeastern Asia Minor, where the Persian king had personally led a massive army to confront Alexander's smaller force. The terrain at Issus, a narrow coastal plain hemmed in by mountains and sea, badly limited Darius's ability to bring his numerical advantage to bear, and Alexander, recognizing the opportunity, led a cavalry charge directly at the section of the Persian line where Darius himself commanded from his chariot. As Alexander's forces closed the distance and the fighting around the Persian king's own position grew desperate, Darius, according to several ancient accounts, broke and fled the field, reportedly abandoning his chariot, his royal cloak, his bow, and, most consequentially for the campaign's propaganda value, his own mother, wife, and children, all of whom fell into Alexander's hands as prisoners in the aftermath. Alexander's treatment of the captured Persian royal family became, in the retelling, one of the great set-piece demonstrations of his character. Multiple ancient sources describe him treating Darius's mother, Sysigambe's wife, and daughters with conspicuous respect and comfort rather than the humiliation ordinarily reserved for a defeated enemy's household. A choice some historians read as genuine personal magnanimity and others read as calculated statecraft, since Alexander was already, at this point in the campaign, beginning to imagine himself not merely as Persia's conqueror but eventually as its legitimate ruler, a role that a reputation for cruelty toward the old royal family would only complicate. Whatever combination of instinct and calculation drove the decision, it worked in his favor. Sysigambe's in particular is reported to have come to regard Alexander with something close to genuine maternal affection in the years that followed, reportedly mourning his death, when it eventually came, more deeply than she had ever mourned her own son's earlier defeat and death. The victory at Issus also delivered Alexander a windfall that transformed the practical financing of his entire campaign, Darius's field treasury, along with the wealth of the Persian city of Damascus, where much of the royal court's baggage and treasure had been sent for safekeeping before the battle, fell largely intact into Macedonian hands, providing Alexander with the funds needed to pay his army, hire additional mercenaries, and sustain a campaign that, only months earlier, had been operating on financial fumes. With Darius fleeing east to rebuild his forces, Alexander turned south along the Mediterranean coast, toward a string of Phoenician and Levantine cities whose surrender or resistance would determine whether the Persian navy retained any base from which to threaten his lines of supply and communication back to Greece. And it was here, at a city called Tyre, that the war's most brutal chapter was about to unfold. The Phoenician city of Tyre presented Alexander with a military problem unlike anything he had yet faced. Built on an island roughly half a mile off the mainland coast, protected by high walls and a powerful navy, Tyre initially offered to remain neutral in the war between Alexander and Darius, an offer Alexander rejected, insisting instead on being permitted to enter the city and personally offer sacrifice at its temple to Melkart, a god the Greeks identified with Heracles. The Tyrians, understanding this request as effectively demanding submission while retaining the appearance of neutral religious courtesy, refused, and Alexander responded by committing his army to a siege that would ultimately last 7 months, one of the longest and most technically demanding operations of his entire career. Lacking a fleet capable of directly challenging Tyre's navy in the siege's early phase, Alexander ordered the construction of a massive stone and timber causeway extending from the mainland to the island itself, using rubble from the ruins of the mainland settlement of Old Tyre as raw material, a project that consumed months of relentless labor under repeated harassment from Tyrian ships, fireships, and defenders dropping heated sand and other improvised weapons onto the workers below. The engineering challenge grew more severe as the causeway approached the island itself and the surrounding water deepened, forcing Alexander's engineers to widen the structure considerably to support ever larger siege towers, some reportedly standing several stories tall and clad in iron to resist Tyrian fireships, while Tyrian divers reportedly worked beneath the waterline to sabotage the causeway's pilings, and Tyrian engineers experimented with early forms of grappling and catapult-based countermeasures against the approaching Macedonian works, turning the siege into as much a contest of engineering ingenuity as of raw force. The eventual arrival of a large allied fleet from Phoenician cities that had already submitted, along with ships from Cyprus, finally gave Alexander naval superiority sufficient to blockade the island directly, and after the causeway was extended and reinforced with massive siege towers, Macedonian forces finally breached Tyre's walls in the summer of 332 BCE. What followed the breach was among the most brutal episodes of Alexander's entire career, and this telling will not soften it. In the fighting and reprisals that followed the city's fall, ancient sources report that somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 Tyrians were killed, while the survivors, numbering in the tens of thousands by most ancient estimates, were sold into slavery, and, according to several accounts, a number of the city's defenders were crucified along the shoreline as a deliberate act of terror aimed at any other city considering resistance. The scale and manner of the reprisal at Tyre exceeded even the destruction of Thebes years earlier, and ancient historians writing in later generations, even those broadly sympathetic to Alexander's legacy, generally record the siege's aftermath without attempting to excuse it as anything other than what it plainly was, a calculated demonstration of what defiance would cost, delivered against a city that had, in fairness to the Tyrians, done little more than decline to grant a foreign king ceremonial access to their own temple. From Tyre, Alexander continued south along the coast toward Egypt and encountered one further significant obstacle at the city of Gaza, a heavily fortified settlement whose governor, a eunuch named Battus, refused surrender despite having, by most accounts, no realistic hope of holding against Alexander's forces indefinitely. The siege of Gaza lasted roughly 2 months and cost Alexander another serious wound, an arrow through the shoulder that nearly proved fatal, and when the city finally fell, its treatment mirrored Tyre's in its severity. The male population was reportedly killed, the women and children enslaved, and Battus himself, according to at least one ancient account whose accuracy modern historians treat with real skepticism given its clear echo of Achilles' treatment of Hector's body in the Iliad, was dragged alive behind a chariot around the city walls. Whether that final detail reflects an actual historical act or a later writer's attempt to cast Alexander explicitly in Achilles' mold, even in his cruelty, the broader pattern across both Tyre and Gaza is not seriously disputed. Cities that resisted Alexander directly paid a price calibrated to deter every other city watching from a distance, and that price was paid, disproportionately, by ordinary inhabitants who had little say in their governor's decision to resist in the first place. It is worth noting, in fairness to the broader arc of the campaign, that not every city facing Alexander chose resistance, and the coastal cities that did open their gates without a fight were, almost without exception, treated with genuine leniency, their existing governance often left largely intact under nominal Macedonian oversight. A contrast stark enough that it is difficult to read the destruction at Tyre and Gaza as simple bloodlust rather than calculated policy. Submission was rewarded generously, and defiance was punished in a manner designed to make the calculation obvious to the next city down the coast. With the Levantine coast secured and Persian naval power effectively neutralized, the road south into Egypt lay open, and Egypt, unlike Tyre and Gaza, would offer Alexander something no city or battlefield victory had had, a welcome, and a kind of religious legitimacy that would reshape how he understood his own place in the world. Alexander entered Egypt in the winter of 332 BCE to find a population with little loyalty left to defend. Since Persian rule over Egypt had been comparatively recent and widely resented, following a reconquest only a decade or so earlier after a period of Egyptian independence. The Persian satrap governing Egypt surrendered without meaningful resistance, and Alexander was received, according to Egyptian religious and political tradition, in a manner closer to a legitimate successor to the pharaohs than a foreign occupier, undergoing coronation rites that formally proclaimed him pharaoh and, within Egyptian religious cosmology, a living son of the god Ammonius. This was not simply diplomatic theater on Alexander's part, though it certainly served diplomatic purposes. Egyptian religious tradition had long held that the reigning pharaoh was, in some meaningful sense, the son of the chief god, and Alexander's court was perfectly willing to let this Egyptian theological framework reinforce the same divine or semi-divine self-conception that Olympias's stories about Zeus had planted in him since childhood. Alexander's administrative arrangement for Egypt following his coronation also reflected a caution not always visible elsewhere in his conduct. Rather than appointing a single powerful governor who might use Egypt's wealth and relative isolation to build an independent power base, he divided authority among multiple Egyptian and Macedonian officials with overlapping and deliberately competing jurisdictions, a structure that suggests a young king already thinking carefully, even this early in his campaign, about how difficult it would be to hold distant, wealthy territories together once his own attention and army had moved on to conquests further east. It was during this period in Egypt that Alexander made a journey that would prove enormously consequential for how both his contemporaries and later generations understood him. A difficult trek across the Libyan desert to the remote oasis of Siwa, home to an oracle of Ammonius whose reputation for accuracy rivaled the great oracle of Apollo at Delphi in the Greek world. The journey itself was arduous and, according to several ancient accounts, nearly disastrous, with Alexander's party reportedly losing their way in a sandstorm before being guided back on course by ravens or, in another version of the story, by talking serpents, details that later writers, and quite possibly Alexander's own court propagandists, were happy to preserve precisely because they reinforced the sense that the gods themselves were personally invested in guiding him toward this particular oracle. What exactly was said between Alexander and the priest of Ammonius inside the oracle's sanctuary has never been reliably established, since Alexander himself, according to Plutarch, refused ever afterward to disclose the details of the exchange to anyone outside a small circle, and the ancient sources that do offer accounts of the conversation disagree substantially on specifics. The consistent thread running through nearly every version, however, is that Alexander emerged from Siwa believing, or at minimum permitting others to believe, that the oracle had confirmed him as the son of Zeus Ammonius. The Greek and Egyptian conceptions of divine kingship merged into a single confirmation of his singular destiny. The journey to Siwa also carried real strategic value quite apart from its religious significance, since the oasis sat along an important route linking Egypt to the wider North African interior, and a personal visit by the new pharaoh to one of the most venerated religious sites in the Egyptian world reinforced, in terms the local population understood intimately, that Alexander intended to rule Egypt through its own existing religious and cultural framework rather than simply impose a foreign administration on top of it by force alone. Some modern historians treat this episode with considerable skepticism, suggesting the oracle's pronouncement, whatever it actually was, has been substantially embellished by later tradition eager to explain Alexander's later behavior and self-presentation in terms of a single dramatic revelation. Others take the episode more seriously as a genuine turning point, noting that Alexander's conduct and rhetoric in the years following Siwa show a marked, documented increase in the language of personal divinity, culminating years later in demands, deeply unpopular among his own Macedonian officers, that visitors to his court perform a Persian-style prostration gesture ordinarily reserved for approaching a god. Whichever interpretation is closer to the truth, the Siwa oracle marks a real inflection point in how Alexander understood himself, and it is difficult to separate the man who emerged from that desert sanctuary from the man who would go on, within a matter of years, to demand recognition not merely as a great king, but as something considerably more than that. Before leaving Egypt, Alexander also founded what would become, in the centuries following his death, the most enduring monument to his own name anywhere in the ancient world, the city of Alexandria, sited at a natural harbor on Egypt's Mediterranean coast, laid out, according to tradition, personally by Alexander himself using a design sketched in the sand with barley grain when no chalk was available. An improvised beginning for a city that would go on to become one of the greatest centers of learning and commerce in the ancient Mediterranean, home in later generations to its famous library and lighthouse. Of the roughly 20 cities Alexander would found or refound across his campaigns, most bearing some version of his own name, Alexandria in Egypt would prove by far the most consequential and long-lived. A strange kind of immortality for a king whose empire itself would not survive his death by more than a few years. With Egypt secured, legitimized, and now literally bearing his name on its coastline, Alexander turned back north and east to finish what he had started at Issus, a final reckoning with Darius, who had spent the intervening 2 years assembling the largest army the Persian Empire could still muster, in one last attempt to save his throne. After more than a year spent consolidating his hold on Egypt and the eastern Mediterranean coast, Alexander turned inland toward Mesopotamia in pursuit of Darius, who had used the intervening time to gather what ancient sources describe, with the exaggeration typical of ancient battle accounts, as an army numbering in the hundreds of thousands, drawn from across the full breadth of the Persian Empire's territories, including contingents of scythe chariots and a small number of war elephants, brought from the empire's eastern satrapies. Modern historians treat the largest ancient figures for the Persian force with considerable skepticism, since ancient armies were notoriously difficult to count accurately and had every propagandistic incentive to inflate an enemy's numbers in order to magnify the scale of a subsequent victory. But even conservative modern estimates agree that Darius commanded a force substantially larger than Alexander's roughly 47,000 men. Darius chose to make his stand on a broad, deliberately leveled plain near the village of Gaugamela, in what is now northern Iraq. Ground he selected specifically because its openness would allow his numerically superior cavalry and scythe chariots room to maneuver and envelop Alexander's smaller force, learning, in effect, from the cramped terrain at Issus that had squandered his earlier numerical advantage. The battle, fought in the autumn of 331 BCE, would become the single most consequential engagement of Alexander's career and one of the most studied battles in military history, a demonstration of tactical improvisation under extreme pressure that later commanders across the centuries would return to and analyze. Alexander's tactical approach at Gaugamela reflected an unusual combination of caution and audacity. Before the battle, he ordered his engineers to level the ground on his own side of the field to neutralize buried spikes and caltrops the Persians had reportedly scattered to disable cavalry, and arranged his infantry not in the simple straight line traditional Greek warfare favored, but in an oblique, echelon formation with a secondary reserve line positioned specifically to wheel and face any Persian force that succeeded in wrapping around his flanks, a defensive in-depth arrangement. Almost unheard of in a period when most armies committed their entire force to a single frontal engagement. As the battle developed, Darius's forces succeeded in partially enveloping Alexander's flanks, and at several points the Macedonian position appeared genuinely precarious, with Persian cavalry and chariot forces threatening to break through to Alexander's camp in the rear. The scythe chariots Darius had positioned to spearhead his center largely failed to achieve their intended shock effect, disabled or diverted by Macedonian light infantry trained specifically to open lanes in their own formation and strike at the chariot horses and drivers as the vehicles rumbled past, rendering what Darius had hoped would be a decisive opening weapon into little more than a chaotic nuisance by the time the main lines of infantry finally closed. Alexander's response was to deliberately widen the gap in the Persian center that this enveloping maneuver created, and then to lead his elite companion cavalry in a driving wedge-shaped charge directly at that gap, aimed once again, as at Issus, straight at Darius's own position at the center of the Persian line. As Macedonian cavalry closed on his position amid ferocious close fighting, Darius, for the second time in his reign, broke and fled the field rather than risk capture or death, a decision that, whatever the tactical logic behind it, would define the remainder of his reputation far more than anything else he did as king. With the Persian king's flight, the coherence of his massive but hastily assembled army collapsed, and what followed was less a battle than a rout, with Alexander's forces pursuing the fleeing Persians for a considerable distance before eventually breaking off pursuit, both to rest exhausted men and horses, and because Alexander had received word that his own left flank had come under severe pressure during his own decisive charge and needed relief. Gaugamela effectively decided the fate of the Persian Empire. In the aftermath, the great Persian cities of Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis all surrendered to Alexander's advancing forces in rapid succession, delivering into his hands treasuries of a scale that ancient sources describe in staggering terms. Persepolis alone reportedly yielded a hoard of gold and silver bullion so vast that it required thousands of pack animals to transport. Alexander's handling of these newly won territories revealed an approach to imperial governance considerably more pragmatic than his earlier destruction of Thebes, Tyre, and Gaza might suggest was his only mode of operating, rather than replacing the entire Persian administrative structure with Macedonian officials wholesale. He retained a number of existing Persian satraps in their posts, particularly in regions where local knowledge and established loyalty among the population mattered more. Then ethnic uniformity, layering Macedonian military garrisons and financial overseers on top of an administrative system he judged, correctly, would be far too costly and disruptive to dismantle and rebuild from scratch across an empire this vast. It was at Persepolis, the ceremonial and religious heart of the Persian Empire and the site of its most magnificent royal architecture, that one of the more troubling and debated episodes of Alexander's career took place. During a night of heavy drinking and celebration, the palace complex was burned, an act several ancient sources attribute to a drunken impulse encouraged by an Athenian courtesan named Thais, who reportedly urged the burning as symbolic revenge for the Persian destruction of Athenian temples generations earlier during the Persian invasion of Greece, while other accounts suggest the burning was a calculated, sober political decision made by Alexander to signal the definitive end of Persian imperial power. Modern historians remain divided on which explanation is closer to the truth, and on whether Alexander regretted the decision afterward, as at least one ancient tradition claims he did upon sobering. What is not disputed is the result, one of the greatest architectural achievements of the ancient Near East, a complex built and adorned across nearly 2 centuries by generations of Persian kings, was reduced to the ruins that archaeologists would eventually excavate more than 2,000 years later. With Persia's ceremonial heart in ashes and its treasuries in Macedonian hands, only Darius himself remained at large, fleeing east with a shrinking retinue of increasingly unreliable followers. And it was in that flight that the last Achaemenid king of Persia would meet his end, not at Alexander's hand, but at the hands of his own men. Darius's flight east after Gaugamela ended not in battle but in betrayal. A group of his own satraps and officers, led by a nobleman named Bessus who governed the eastern satrapy of Bactria, seized the fleeing king, and when Alexander's pursuing cavalry finally closed the distance, they found Darius already dead or dying, stabbed by his own captors rather than surrendered to his pursuing enemy. Alexander, according to several ancient accounts, arrived to find Darius still barely alive, or arrived shortly after his death, and responded by sending the body back to Persepolis for a formal royal burial in keeping with Persian custom, and by publicly denouncing Bessus's act as the murder of a legitimate king rather than a justified deposition, positioning himself, quite deliberately, as Darius's rightful avenger and successor rather than merely his conqueror. Bessus himself, who had proclaimed his own claim to the Persian throne following Darius's death, would be pursued for roughly 2 more years across the empire's eastern reaches before finally being captured, mutilated according to Persian custom for regicide, and executed, a fate Alexander sanctioned specifically through Persian legal and ceremonial channels rather than simple battlefield justice, a telling early sign of how thoroughly he had already begun positioning himself within a Persian, rather than purely Macedonian, framework of legitimate kingship. It was in the years following Darius's death that Alexander's adoption of Persian customs, dress, and court ceremonial became genuinely pronounced, and genuinely controversial among his own Macedonian officers and soldiers. He began wearing elements of Persian royal dress, incorporated Persian nobles into his administration and eventually his officer corps, and moved toward adopting proskynesis, the Persian court practice of prostrating oneself before the king, a gesture that within Persian cultural context carried no particular implication of worship, but which Greek and Macedonian visitors understood as a gesture properly reserved for gods alone, making Alexander's apparent expectation of it deeply uncomfortable. For men who had grown up regarding their king as, at most, first among equals. Several of Alexander's closest Macedonian companions resisted these changes, viewing them as a betrayal of Macedonian identity and a dangerous slide toward exactly the kind of despotic, godlike kingship that Greek political thought had traditionally defined itself against. There was, underlying Alexander's adoption of Persian customs, a practical governing logic that his Macedonian critics were not always inclined to credit him with. An empire this size, encompassing dozens of peoples, languages, and religious traditions stretching from the Aegean to the edge of India, could not realistically be held together indefinitely by a small occupying class of Macedonians alone, and incorporating Persian nobles, administrators, and eventually soldiers into the structure of his rule was, whatever its personal or symbolic costs among his own countrymen, arguably the only durable long-term strategy available to him if the empire was meant to outlast his own lifetime rather than simply function as an extended raid on a scale no one had previously attempted. This tension between Alexander's increasingly Persian-influenced self-conception and his own Macedonian officer corps' traditional expectations would produce, within a short span of years, two of the darkest episodes of his entire reign. The first came during a drinking banquet in the Sogdian city of Maracanda, where Alexander and a close companion and cavalry commander named Clitus, a man who had, years earlier, personally saved Alexander's life at the Battle of Granicus by cutting down the Persian noble about to deliver a fatal blow, became embroiled in a heated, increasingly drunken argument over the relative merits of Macedonian versus Persian customs, and over whether Alexander's recent achievements had eclipsed those of his father Philip, a comparison Clitus, well into his cups, pressed with mounting recklessness. The argument escalated until Alexander, in a rage that several ancient sources suggest was fueled as much by wine as by genuine offense, seized a spear from a nearby guard and killed Clitus on the spot, in front of a room full of witnesses. Ancient accounts describe Alexander's reaction afterward in vivid terms, days of what is described as genuine, prostrate grief and self-recrimination, reportedly refusing food and attempting to invoke his own death as penance, before eventually being persuaded by his officers and by court philosophers summoned specifically for the purpose that a king's grief, however sincere, could not be allowed to paralyze an ongoing military campaign. Some modern historians read Alexander's grief as a genuine, spontaneous horror at what wine and anger had driven him to do to a man who had once saved his life. Others read it more cynically, as calculated public theater designed to manage the political fallout of killing a popular and senior Macedonian officer in a fit of temper. Both readings can be true simultaneously without contradiction, and the episode remains, by any honest measure, one of the ugliest and most human moments of Alexander's entire career. The second episode, somewhat later, involved a more calculated and far more consequential purge. A conspiracy against Alexander's life was uncovered, or alleged, involving a group of Macedonian officers, and the investigation implicated Philotas, the senior cavalry commander and son of Parmenion, one of Philip's oldest and most trusted generals, who had served Alexander loyally since the very beginning of the campaign and had, by this point, effectively become the second most powerful military figure in the entire army. Philotas was accused of failing to report advance knowledge of the plot, tried before an assembly of Macedonian soldiers in a proceeding whose fairness modern historians treat with considerable skepticism, and executed. Alexander then made the calculated decision to also order the execution of Parmenion himself, who was stationed at a considerable distance from the main army at the time and had, so far as the surviving evidence indicates, no direct involvement in his son's alleged conspiracy at all, a decision most historians read as a preemptive strike against a powerful, senior general whose loyalty, following his son's execution, could no longer be safely assumed. The killing of Parmenion, a man who had served Philip and then Alexander for decades and commanded enormous respect throughout the army, sent an unmistakable signal to every remaining senior officer. Proximity to power and decades of loyal service offered no guaranteed protection if Alexander's trust, for whatever reason, came to be withdrawn. A further episode, connected to Alexander's controversial push toward Persian-style court ceremony, involved the court historian Callisthenes, a relative of Aristotle who had accompanied the campaign specifically to record Alexander's achievements for posterity, and who publicly and pointedly refused to perform the proskynesis prostration Alexander had begun requesting of his court, arguing that the gesture was properly owed to gods alone and that no Greek could honestly offer it to a living man without corrupting the very idea of what separated mortal kings from divine beings. Callisthenes' public defiance embarrassed Alexander in front of his assembled court and was never fully forgiven when a separate conspiracy was uncovered among a group of Alexander's own royal pages. Young Macedonian noble boys serving in the king's personal household, Callisthenes was implicated, whether fairly or as a convenient pretext to remove a man whose earlier public humiliation of the king still rankled, and was executed or died in custody shortly afterward, depending on which ancient account you follow. The page's conspiracy itself arose, according to the sources, from a personal grievance after one of the boys was flogged and had his horse confiscated as punishment for a hunting infraction, and the group's plan to murder Alexander in his sleep was betrayed before it could be carried out, a plot smaller and more personal in its origins than the Philotas affair, but handled with the same unforgiving thoroughness. The pages involved being stoned to death by their own fellow soldiers on Alexander's order. With his officer corps reshaped by fear as much as loyalty, and with the eastern satrapies of the former Persian Empire gradually subdued through a grinding, multi-year campaign of sieges and counterinsurgency across Bactria and Sogdiana, Alexander's ambitions, remarkably, showed no sign of settling for an empire that already dwarfed anything any Macedonian king had previously imagined. Ahead of him lay the mountains of the Hindu Kush, and beyond them, a land no army under Macedonian or Persian command had ever attempted to conquer. By 327 BCE, Alexander had spent the better part of 3 years subduing the fiercely resistant territories of Bactria and Sogdiana in Central Asia, a campaign marked by brutal guerrilla warfare, the storming of seemingly impregnable mountain fortresses, and, notably, his marriage to Roxana, a Bactrian noblewoman whose beauty ancient sources praise extravagantly and whose marriage to Alexander appears to have served genuine political purposes in cementing loyalty among the region's fractious local nobility. The most famous single episode of this Central Asian campaign was the capture of a fortress known as the Sogdian Rock, a seemingly unassailable cliffside stronghold where local nobles had gathered along with their families, confident enough in the position's natural defenses that they reportedly told Alexander's envoys he would need soldiers with wings to take it. Alexander responded by calling for volunteers experienced in mountain climbing, sending several hundred men up the rock face under cover of darkness using tent pegs and rope, and presenting the stunned defenders the following morning with the sight of Macedonian soldiers already standing above their position, a bloodless surrender that, as much as any pitched battle, illustrates the combination of audacity and theatrical psychological pressure that had come to define Alexander's approach to seemingly impossible obstacles. It was among the prisoners taken at the Sogdian Rock, according to tradition, that Alexander first encountered Roxana. With Central Asia at last pacified, at least for the moment, Alexander turned his attention toward India, a region only partially and imperfectly understood by the Greek world, associated in Greek imagination with fabulous wealth, strange animals, and the very edge of the inhabited earth. Crossing the Hindu Kush and then the Indus River, Alexander's forces advanced into the Punjab region of what is now Pakistan, where several local rulers submitted without resistance, while others, most notably a powerful king named Porus, ruler of a kingdom between the Hyphasis and Aegae rivers, prepared to meet the invasion directly. The political landscape Alexander encountered in this region was itself a patchwork of rival Indian kingdoms and tribal confederacies, some bound by long-standing alliance and others by equally long-standing rivalry, and Alexander proved as willing here as he had been in Persia to exploit these existing divisions, securing the cooperation of a local ruler named Taxiles, whose own kingdom lay in long-running rivalry with Porus, and who saw in Alexander's advance a useful opportunity to settle an old regional score under the cover of a much larger foreign invasion. The resulting Battle of the Hyphasis, fought in 326 BCE, presented Alexander with tactical challenges unlike anything his army had previously faced, chiefly Porus's deployment of a substantial force of war elephants, animals capable of terrifying and disrupting cavalry horses unaccustomed to their scent and presence, arrayed along a defensive position on the far bank of a river swollen with monsoon rains. Alexander's solution combined characteristic tactical cunning with considerable logistical risk. He divided his forces, staged repeated feints and diversions up and down the riverbank over a period of days to confuse Porus about where and when the actual crossing would occur, and eventually forced a crossing at night, some distance upstream, catching a portion of Porus's forces off guard before the main Indian army could fully respond. The battle that followed was hard-fought and costly on both sides, with Alexander's infantry and cavalry gradually neutralizing the threat posed by the war elephants through disciplined use of massed pike formations and javelins aimed at the elephants' handlers rather than the animals themselves, eventually driving the wounded, panicked elephants back into their own lines and turning a portion of Porus's own army's cohesion against it. Ancient accounts describe the fighting at Hyphasis as among the most costly of Alexander's entire career in terms of the casualties suffered by his own veteran troops, a reflection of how genuinely dangerous the combination of disciplined Indian infantry, skilled cavalry, and war elephants proved even against an army that had, by this point, defeated every other force put in front of it across nearly a decade of continuous campaigning. Porus himself, wounded multiple times but refusing to flee even as the battle turned decisively against him, was eventually captured, and when brought before Alexander and asked how he wished to be treated, is reported to have answered simply that he wished to be treated as a king treats another king, a response that reportedly impressed Alexander enough that he restored Porus to his throne as a subordinate ally rather than deposing him, an act of magnanimity toward a defeated enemy that echoed, in some respects, his earlier treatment of Darius's captured family after Issus. The Hyphasis campaign, however, came at real cost. Bucephalus, the horse Alexander had tamed as a boy and ridden through more than a decade of campaigning across 3 continents, died in its aftermath, from wounds or from age and exhaustion depending on which ancient account you credit, and Alexander founded a city on the site and named it Bucephala in the animal's memory, one of the more genuinely tender gestures preserved from a career otherwise dominated by conquest and calculation. More significantly for the campaign's future, the fighting at Hyphasis, combined with the increasingly difficult terrain, punishing monsoon rains, and mounting casualties from disease and combat over years of continuous campaigning, had begun to take a serious and visible toll on the morale of Alexander's veteran soldiers, men who had followed him for the better part of a decade across distances and through hardships that had already, by any reasonable historical standard, secured his reputation many times over. Alexander, characteristically, wanted to press on ahead. By the reports his scouts and local informants brought back, lay the Ganges Valley and kingdoms of legendary wealth and military scale, guarded, some reports suggested, by armies with elephant corps numbering in the thousands. For Alexander, this was precisely the kind of challenge that had defined his entire life since the moment he calmed a frightened horse in front of his father's court. For the men who would have to fight that campaign, exhausted, far from home, and increasingly uncertain of what any of it was still for, it represented something closer to the final straw. At the Hyphasis River, in what is now the Indian state of Punjab, Alexander's army finally did something it had never done before in more than 8 years of continuous campaigning across 3 continents. It refused to go any further. The refusal did not take the form of open rebellion or violence against Alexander personally, but of something arguably more devastating to a king who had built his entire identity around being followed to the ends of the earth, a quiet, collective, unmovable exhaustion that no appeal to glory, honor, or shared destiny could overcome. According to Arrian, one of the more historically careful ancient sources for Alexander's campaigns, the army's officers, when finally pressed by Alexander to explain their reluctance, spoke through a respected senior commander named Caenus, who laid out the case plainly. The soldiers had been away from their homes and families for years, had endured wounds, disease, and hardship across a scale of distance no Macedonian or Greek army had ever previously attempted, and simply wished, with whatever wealth and honor they had already won, to be allowed to go home while they still could. Alexander's response, as recorded across several ancient sources, moved through several stages that together paint a vivid portrait of a man encountering, for the first time in his adult life, a limit he could not simply overcome through willpower, tactical brilliance, or personal courage. He is said to have first attempted to shame his officers and soldiers into continuing, invoking the glory that awaited them in the unconquered lands ahead and the disgrace of turning back so close, in his estimation, to the edge of the world. When this failed to move the assembled army, he reportedly retreated to his tent for 3 days in a sulking, isolated silence, a gesture some historians read as a genuine emotional collapse in the face of unprecedented refusal, and others read as one final piece of calculated political theater, an attempt to pressure his men through the implicit threat of a king who might simply abandon his own command rather than accept their limits. Neither approach worked. When Alexander finally emerged and consulted the customary Macedonian practice of taking omens before a major undertaking, the sacrifices, according to several accounts, were interpreted as unfavorable for continuing the advance, a conveniently timed piece of religious cover that allowed Alexander to frame the retreat not as a capitulation to his own soldiers' will, but as obedience to the god's own judgment, preserving something of his dignity and divine self-conception even in defeat. The decision to turn back marked the practical end of Alexander's campaign of conquest, though it would be years yet before his life itself ended. 12 massive stone altars were reportedly erected near the Hyphasis to mark the furthest extent of his advance, monumental markers meant to stand as permanent testimony to how far a Macedonian king had carried his armies, even as those same armies made unmistakably clear that they would carry him no further. Some ancient accounts describe these altars as deliberately oversized beyond ordinary proportion, built tall and broad enough that later peoples encountering them would assume they had been raised by giants rather than ordinary men, a final piece of theater from a king who, even in retreat, seems to have been thinking carefully about how the moment would be remembered by generations who had not been present to see his own soldiers refuse him. It is worth pausing on the strange, almost paradoxical nature of this episode within the larger arc of Alexander's life. Here was a man who had, by every other measure, never encountered a wall he could not eventually break through, not the fortifications of Tyre, not the mountain strongholds of Sogdiana, not the war elephants of Porus. And yet the one obstacle that finally stopped him was not a fortress or an army at all, but the simple, collective exhaustion of the very man whose loyalty and endurance had made every previous victory possible in the first place. Empires built on conquest, it turns out, run not only on the will of the king who commands them, but on the finite patience of the soldiers who make that will real on the battlefield, and at the Hyphasis, for the first time, that patience simply ran out. The retreat that followed would prove, in its own way, nearly as costly as any battle Alexander had yet fought, and it would set in motion the final, darkening chapters of his extraordinary life. Rather than retracing the relatively secure route by which his army had advanced into India, Alexander chose to divide his forces for the return journey, sending a portion of his army and his fleet along different routes while personally leading a substantial contingent through the Gadrosian Desert in what is now southern Pakistan and Iran, a decision whose motives ancient sources describe variously as a desire to punish local tribes who had failed to submit, a wish to outdo the legendary desert crossings of earlier conquerors, or simply an underestimation of the terrain's severity. The fleet, meanwhile, was placed under the command of Nearchus, one of Alexander's boyhood companions from Mysa, who was tasked with sailing the coastline from the mouth of the Indus westward toward the Persian Gulf, charting largely unknown waters, securing fresh water and supplies from often hostile coastal populations along the way, and eventually rendezvousing with Alexander's own battered land force. A maritime achievement that ancient geographers would draw on for generations afterward, even as the land march itself became remembered chiefly for its horror. Whatever the motive, the Gadrosian crossing proved catastrophic. Extreme heat, scarce water, and shifting sand that swallowed supply carts and exhausted pack animals combined to inflict losses that several ancient historians describe as exceeding, in raw human cost, almost any single battle of the entire campaign, with camp followers, the sick, and stragglers dying in numbers significant enough that some ancient accounts claim only a fraction of those who entered the desert emerged from the far side. Alexander himself, according to Arrian, insisted on sharing the ordinary hardships of the march rather than availing himself of the comforts his rank could have provided, reportedly pouring out onto the sand a rare helmet full of water offered to him by his own soldiers rather than drink while his men went thirsty, a gesture ancient writers clearly intended as evidence of genuine solidarity with his suffering troops, whatever additional propaganda value it also carried. Upon emerging from the desert and reuniting with his surviving officials, Alexander also conducted a sweeping investigation into the conduct of satraps and governors he had left in charge of various eastern territories during his years away campaigning in India, and the results were not encouraging. Several officials were found to have abused their authority, looted local populations, or, in a few cases, assumed Alexander was unlikely to survive the Indian campaign or the desert crossing at all, and had begun acting with an independence bordering on outright rebellion. A number of these men were executed on Alexander's return, a purge that, while directed at genuine abuses rather than personal rivals in the way the Philotas affair had been, further reinforced among his remaining officer corps the lesson that distance from the king's immediate presence offered no lasting safety from his judgment. Having survived the desert crossing and reunited his scattered forces, Alexander staged, at the ancient Persian ceremonial city of Susa, one of the more extraordinary and revealing spectacles of his entire reign, a mass wedding ceremony in which Alexander himself and roughly 90 of his senior Macedonian officers married Persian and other Asian noblewomen in a single coordinated event. A deliberate and enormously expensive attempt to physically and symbolically fuse the Macedonian conquering elite with the Persian nobility they had displaced. The scale of the Susa ceremony itself was staggering even by the standards of Alexander's other spectacles. Ancient sources describe a vast tinted pavilion constructed specifically for the occasion, capable of seating many thousands of guests, with the individual weddings conducted according to Persian custom over several days of continuous feasting, music, and entertainment funded directly from the royal treasury, at a cost some ancient estimates place in the many thousands of talents of silver, a single ceremonial gesture consuming resources that could otherwise have funded a substantial military campaign in its own right. Alexander himself took 2 additional wives at Susa, both daughters of Persian royal lineage, alongside his existing marriage to Roxana, while providing substantial dowries for every officer involved, a policy that some ancient and modern historians read as a genuinely visionary attempt at lasting cultural and political fusion between conqueror and conquered, and others read as a policy imposed from above that most of the Macedonian officers involved abandoned or simply ignored the moment. Alexander's direct authority over their personal lives ended, which for many of them came within a very short time of his death. Around this same period, Alexander also moved to integrate thousands of Persian young men, trained in Macedonian-style weapons and tactics over preceding years, directly into his military structure, a policy that provoked open, serious unrest among his veteran Macedonian soldiers at a place called Opus, where long-simmering resentment over what many perceived as Alexander's abandonment of Macedonian tradition in favor of Persian customs and personnel finally boiled over into a mutiny that Alexander suppressed only through a combination of harsh punishment of ringleaders and an emotionally charged reconciliation speech and banquet that ancient sources describe in considerable, possibly embellished, detail. At Opus, when Alexander announced his intention to discharge his older and wounded Macedonian veterans and send them home with generous rewards while continuing to rely on Persian troops for his ongoing campaigns, his soldiers reportedly responded not merely with grumbling but with open mockery, jeering that he should simply campaign with his new Persian father, Zeus Ammonius, and leave the men who had actually won his empire for him to go home unrewarded. Alexander responded by personally arresting the loudest ringleaders and having them executed on the spot, then locking himself away for several days in a public display of wounded withdrawal not unlike his earlier retreat after the Hyphasis mutiny, until his assembled soldiers, in genuine distress at the prospect of losing their king's favor entirely, begged forgiveness outside his tent, leading to a mass reconciliation banquet at which Macedonians and Persians reportedly drank together from a shared bowl, and Alexander offered a prayer for harmony between the two peoples he had spent a decade binding into a single, uneasy empire. It was in the midst of these final years of consolidation, ceremony, and simmering internal tension that Alexander suffered the personal loss that several ancient sources suggest affected him more deeply than any other event of his adult life, the death of Hyphasis, his closest companion since childhood, a man whose relationship with Alexander ancient and modern historians alike have long debated in terms of its precise romantic or platonic character, but whose emotional centrality to Alexander's life is not seriously disputed regardless of how that specific question is resolved. Hyphasis died at Aegae, likely of a fever, possibly compounded by excessive drinking against his physician's advice, and Alexander's grief, as described across multiple ancient sources, bordered on the theatrically extreme even by the standards of ancient royal mourning. He reportedly had the treating physician executed, ordered the manes and tails of the army's horses and mules shorn in mourning, demolished the battlements of a nearby city as a gesture of grief, and began planning a funeral monument and associated religious honors for Hyphasis of a scale ordinarily reserved for gods or the most legendary of heroes. The funeral monument Alexander commissioned at Babylon, according to ancient descriptions, was designed as an enormous stepped structure many stories tall, adorned with gilded eagles, sculpted lions, and friezes depicting mythological battle scenes, at a projected cost so extravagant that later ancient writers treated the whole project as a byword for excessive royal grief, and the structure itself, still incomplete at the time of Alexander's own death only months later, was apparently abandoned entirely once the king whose devotion had commissioned it was no longer alive to see it finished. Alexander further petitioned the oracle at Siwa for permission to honor Hyphasis with the formal religious status of a divine hero, a request the oracle reportedly granted, allowing sacrifices to be offered in Hyphasis' name across the empire even before Alexander's own death rendered such distinctions somewhat moot. Some ancient writers describe Alexander as never fully recovering his previous emotional equilibrium in the months remaining to him after Hyphasis' death, a detail some modern historians treat as significant context for understanding Alexander's own final decline, and others treat with appropriate caution as the kind of dramatic narrative flourish ancient biographers were prone to add in retrospect once they already knew a story was heading toward its subject's own death. Whatever the precise psychological truth, Alexander himself had, by this point, less than a year left to live, and the manner of his death, when it came, would prove nearly as contested and consequential as any battle he had ever fought. In the spring of 323 BCE, Alexander returned to Babylon, the ancient Mesopotamian city that had, since its surrender following Gaugamela years earlier, functioned as one of the practical administrative centers of his sprawling empire, and began making preparations for what would have been yet another ambitious campaign, this time directed toward the Arabian Peninsula, alongside broader plans for administrative reorganization and further monumental building projects across his territories. Ancient sources describe an almost restless quality to Alexander's final months of planning, with schemes reportedly under discussion for further campaigns along the North African coast and into the Western Mediterranean, the construction of an enormous funeral monument for his father Philip on a scale to rival the great wonders of the ancient world, and continued efforts to integrate Persian administrative and military personnel more fully into an imperial structure that, on paper at least, showed no sign of settling into a fixed, final form, the ambitions of a king who, whatever exhaustion his own soldiers had shown at the Hyphasis, seems to have carried no comparable exhaustion of his own. It was during this period of preparation, following an extended evening of feasting and drinking with his companions, that Alexander fell ill with a fever that would, over the course of the following 10 to 12 days, steadily worsened despite the attention of the court physicians, until he became unable to speak and, according to several accounts, was reduced to acknowledging his officers, who filed past his bedside in a final procession only with his eyes. The precise cause of Alexander's death has never been established with confidence, and this uncertainty is not a modern historical failure so much as a reflection of the genuinely limited and ambiguous evidence available even to writers working centuries closer to the event than we are today. Natural explanations proposed by ancient and modern writers alike include malaria, typhoid fever, complications from an old lung wound sustained years earlier during his campaigns, or an infection possibly connected to his years of hard drinking and the physical toll of near-constant wounds accumulated across a decade of front-line combat. Poisoning theories have also circulated since antiquity, with some ancient sources naming specific suspects, including members of the powerful Macedonian noble family of Antipater, who governed Macedon itself in Alexander's absence and had, by this point in the reign, a genuinely tense relationship with Alexander involving mutual suspicion and at least one serious court dispute. Modern toxicological and medical analyses of the described symptoms have produced a range of competing hypotheses, including proposals involving specific poisons capable of producing a prolonged illness matching the ancient descriptions, though no such analysis can be considered definitive given the centuries-old, second-hand nature of all the surviving symptomatic descriptions. The so-called royal diaries, court records purportedly kept by officials close to Alexander that describe his final illness in something close to day-by-day detail, survive only in fragments quoted by later ancient historians rather than as an original document, and their authenticity is itself a matter of ongoing scholarly dispute. Some historians treating them as a genuine, contemporary record that lends real weight to the natural illness explanation, others suspecting them of being a later literary construction designed specifically to counter poisoning rumors that had begun circulating in the volatile political climate immediately following Alexander's death, when several of the men most likely to benefit from his absence had every reason to want the official record to describe a natural death rather than a murder they might themselves be suspected of arranging. The honest and appropriately cautious position, and the one most modern historians of the period ultimately adopt, is that the available evidence simply does not permit a confident determination between natural illness and deliberate poisoning, and that both explanations remain genuinely live possibilities rather than one being clearly favored by the surviving record. What is not disputed is the political vacuum his death immediately created, and the manner in which it was handled captures, in miniature, everything unstable about the empire Alexander had built. As his officers gathered around his failing body, they are reported to have asked him directly to whom he left his kingdom, and received, according to the most widely repeated tradition, the famously ambiguous answer, to the strongest, 3 words that, whether historically accurate or a later invention capturing a deeper truth about the situation, perfectly anticipated the chaos that was about to follow. Alexander died on the 10th or 11th of June, 323 BCE, at approximately 32 years old, having spent almost exactly 13 years as king and having personally led his armies across a territory stretching from Greece to the Indian subcontinent, a scope of conquest that no individual human being before him, and arguably none since, had achieved within a single lifetime. He left behind no clear adult heir. His son Roxana would not be born until months after his death, and his other potential heir, a half-brother named Aristotle, suffered from what ancient sources describe as a significant intellectual disability that made him, in the eyes of most of the assembled Macedonian officer corps, unsuitable to rule in his own right without extensive support. Into this vacuum stepped the very men who had built their careers and their loyalty on Alexander's personal command, and who now, with the singular will that had held their fractious alliance together suddenly and permanently absent, would spend the following decades discovering exactly how little of what Alexander had built could survive without him. In the immediate aftermath of Alexander's death, his assembled generals and senior officers convened in Babylon to determine the succession, a meeting that revealed, within hours, how thoroughly Alexander's personal authority had substituted for any durable institutional structure capable of managing a transition of power. After considerable argument, a compromise was reached. Alexander's mentally disabled half-brother Aristeus would be proclaimed king alongside Alexander's unborn child. Should Roxana's pregnancy produce a son, with actual governing authority distributed among Alexander's leading generals as regents and satraps over the empire's various territories, an arrangement that satisfied no one fully and that few of the parties involved appear to have expected to last. Roxana did, in fact, give birth to a son, Alexander IV, shortly after these arrangements were made, and, in an episode that tells you plainly how quickly the moral restraint of Alexander's own reign evaporated once he was no longer present to enforce it, she is reported, with the support of Alexander's mother Olympias, to have had Alexander's other wife Statira, one of the Persian princesses, married at Susa, and Statira's sister murdered shortly afterward, eliminating a potential rival claim before it could mature into one. The settlement reached at Babylon did not survive intact for even a full year before its participants began openly maneuvering against one another for greater shares of power and territory, initiating a series of conflicts that later historians would collectively term the Wars of the Diadochi, or successors, a grinding, multi-decade sequence of shifting alliances, betrayals, and battles fought across the length and breadth of Alexander's former empire by his own most senior and trusted generals. One of the earliest and most telling acts of this unraveling concerned Alexander's own body. His funeral cortege, an enormous and lavishly decorated ceremonial carriage built over roughly 2 years to transport his embalmed remains back toward Macedon for burial, was intercepted en route by Ptolemy, who diverted it to Egypt instead, ultimately interring Alexander's body in Memphis and later in Alexandria itself, a calculated act of political theater that allowed Ptolemy to claim a form of legitimacy no other successor general could match: physical possession of the conqueror's own remains, in the city that bore his name, on the territory Ptolemy had already claimed as his own. Perdiccas, still nominally the empire's chief regent at the time, regarded the hijacking of the funeral cortege as an open declaration of defiance, and it became one of the direct triggers for his own subsequent, ultimately fatal invasion of Egypt. Perdiccas, initially the most powerful regent following the Babylon settlement, was assassinated by his own officers within roughly 2 years after an unsuccessful invasion of Egypt against Ptolemy, one of Alexander's most capable former generals who had shrewdly claimed Egypt as his own satrapy immediately after Alexander's death and would go on to found a dynasty there that would rule for nearly 3 centuries. Perdiccas' Egyptian campaign foundered specifically at an attempted crossing of the Nile, where a combination of the river's unpredictable currents, crocodiles, and stubborn Ptolemaic defense drowned or killed a significant portion of his own invading force in a single disastrous attempt. A costly and humiliating failure that left his own officers sufficiently disillusioned with his generalship that a group of them murdered him in his own tent shortly afterward rather than continue a campaign they no longer believed in. Antipater, the aging general who had governed Macedon throughout Alexander's entire campaign, briefly held the empire together as regent following Perdiccas's death, but his own death shortly afterward reopened the succession question yet again, triggering further rounds of conflict among his rivals, including his son Cassander, who would eventually secure control of Macedon and Greece itself, remains that included the execution of both Roxana and the young Alexander IV, extinguishing, within roughly 13 years of Alexander's own death, the last direct line of his blood. Cassander is reported to have kept the boy king and his mother imprisoned for years at Amphipolis before finally ordering their quiet execution once it became clear that enough of the other successor generals had begun using the boy's continued existence as a rallying point against Cassander's own ambitions in Macedon, a final, almost administrative act of dynastic erasure that drew remarkably little recorded outrage at the time, a silence that says as much about how thoroughly the fiction of a unified Argead royal house had already been abandoned in practice as any battle of the preceding decade. Olympias herself, Alexander's mother, remained a significant and ruthless political force in these early years of the succession struggles, at one point securing control of Macedon and ordering the execution of King Philip Aridius and his wife, along with a considerable number of other Macedonian nobles she regarded as enemies, before being besieged, captured, and ultimately executed herself by Cassander's forces, her death removing one of the last surviving figures with any direct personal connection to Alexander's own immediate family. It is worth noting how closely this pattern echoes the very court Alexander himself had grown up inside decades earlier, a royal family securing its position through the elimination of rival claimants, a queen mother wielding real and sometimes lethal political power in her own right, and a throne that ultimately belonged, in practice, to whichever claimant could marshal the greater force rather than to whoever possessed the more legitimate hereditary claim on paper. The instability that had shaped Alexander's own childhood in Pella did not end with his father's assassination. It simply relocated, at a vastly larger scale, to the empire his son and namesake would never live long enough to actually rule. Meanwhile, in the empire's eastern territories, another of Alexander's former officers, Seleucus, gradually assembled control over the vast eastern satrapies stretching from Mesopotamia toward India, founding a dynasty that would govern the largest territorial share of Alexander's former conquests for generations, while Antigonus, one of the most militarily ambitious of all the successor generals, attempted at various points to reunite the entirety of Alexander's former empire under his own single rule, an ambition that ultimately united the other successor generals against him in a coalition that defeated and killed him at the Battle of Ipsus roughly 2 decades after Alexander's own death. The years leading to Ipsus saw a near-constant churn of shifting coalitions among the successors, marked by major engagements such as the Battle of Gaza, where a young Ptolemy allied with Seleucus to hand Antigonus's own son a serious defeat, and the long, grinding campaigns of Eumenes, a Greek secretary-turned-general who fought with real skill on behalf of the royal house against Antigonus for years before finally being betrayed by his own increasingly mutinous troops and handed over for execution. One further, small echo of the same pattern that had ended Darius's reign a generation earlier, of a commander undone not by his enemies directly, but by the men who were supposed to be fighting on his own side. By the time the fighting among the Diadochi had settled, roughly 2 generations after Alexander himself had died in that Babylonian bedchamber, his once unified empire had fractured permanently into a handful of separate successor kingdoms, the Ptolemaic kingdom centered on Egypt, The Seleucid Empire, spanning much of the former Persian heartland and beyond, the Antigonid dynasty ruling Macedon itself, and several smaller successor states scattered across Asia Minor and the Eastern Mediterranean, kingdoms that would, in their own right, go on to shape the political and cultural landscape of the ancient world for centuries to come, spreading Greek language, art, and learning across territories from the western Mediterranean to the borders of India in the broad cultural transformation later historians would call the Hellenistic Age. Of these successor states, Ptolemy's Egyptian kingdom would prove the longest lived, enduring for nearly 3 full centuries under an unbroken line of his own descendants, ending only generations later with its final, celebrated queen, a woman who bore Alexander's own conqueror's ambitions in miniature and who would, in her own turn, watch her kingdom absorbed by a new and rising Mediterranean power the way Alexander himself had once absorbed the kingdom of Darius. And yet not one of these successor kingdoms ever again approached the singular, unified scale of the empire Alexander himself had commanded at the moment of his death, because that empire, in the truest sense, had never really been a single institution at all. It had been an extension of one man's will, held together by his own personal command of loyalty, fear, and ambition among the very generals who now, in his absence, spent their own remaining lives fighting each other over its broken pieces. The boy who calmed a frightened horse by turning it toward the sun, who carried Homer beneath his pillow beside a dagger, who cut through a knot rather than patiently untangling it, and who marched an army to the edge of the known world only to watch that same army finally refuse to go one step further, had in the space of 13 years reshaped the map of 3 continents. And when he was gone, the map he had drawn did not so much survive him as slowly, violently, come apart in the hands of the men he had trained to hold it, a final, fitting testament to an empire that had, from its very first spear thrown into Asian soil, always been built around a single, irreplaceable man rather than anything built to outlast him.